We listen to that parable that Jesus just told in that gospel reading that I just read. And I can tell you, on the surface, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't. And so we're left wondering, what's the point that Jesus was making? What is the message that Jesus wants us to hear? I read a commentary earlier in the week that was called Provoking Gospel, and I actually like the title of it because I think the gospel is provoking, and we should always read it in a way that provokes us and provokes faith and action in us. In any case, I really like what the commentator said about this passage. He said, "Who in their right mind would think that being crafty and rewriting contracts is the way to make friends and future business partners? Friends in business tell me that they aim always to hire the best person. And by best, they mean the person they can trust, the person of character and solid integrity, the person you don't have to watch all the time. I'm still trying to find such a person in the parable. No such luck so far." Well, I can understand what he's saying. Parable has become known as the story of the shrewd manager, or the dishonest manager, or the scrupulous manager. And in the story, he is described as shrewd. Shrewd. So when you hear that word, shrewd, or you hear someone described as shrewd, what comes to mind for you? What does it mean? That person is shrewd.
Penny pinching?
A penny pincher? Okay. Anything else about what it might mean to describe someone as shrewd?
Sometimes clever.
Sometimes clever?
Problem solver.
A problem solver. Analytical. So if someone were to describe you as shrewd, would you see that as a compliment? I don't think so. No. But you know what? There are elements of being shrewd that are actually to our advantage, and that are actually good qualities. I know when I first hear that word, and when I first think of it, those positive qualities are not the ones that come to mind for me. It's all the things that go with being a shrewd. Right? Well, the master commended the manager because he was shrewd. That sounds positive and affirming, doesn't it? Not negative or accusing. When I turn to Mr. Google and type into Mr. Google, define shrewd, this is what Mr. Google comes up with. Having or showing sharp powers of judgment, astute, clever discerning awareness, clear understanding and good judgment of a situation, judging people and situations well and making appropriate decisions as a result. I have to tell you, that's not what I thought it meant to be shrewd. But that's what Mr. Google says, and Mr. Google is right. A friend and a colleague, a priest whose name is Daniel, shared this interpretation when I put it out there to my colleagues and said, "What does shrewd mean to you?" This is what he said. I really liked it. And I'm going to quote him directly. He said, "The dishonest manager is Jesus. The dishonest manager is Jesus." And at first I thought, really? Dishonest? Jesus? Anyway, then he went on to say, "He cuts our debts and is justified by his master for doing so." And that's exactly what Jesus does, right? He cuts our debts out completely. Just like the manager did in the story. The Pharisees see him as making friends by dishonest wealth. And what is that dishonest wealth? It is the grace that they didn't have to pay for. Because if it was worth anything, of course they'd have to pay for it. The shrewdness that Jesus calls for isn't about building up our own wealth or power as individuals, as businesses, or as the church. But to deal with people using the same kind of prodigal grace that we see in the three parables that come right before this parable in the gospel. The shepherd leaves the 99 to go after how many? One. The woman throws an extravagant, expensive party because she found how many coins? One. The one lost coin. And what does the father do to the son who goes away and squanders his inheritance? He welcomes him home with a prodigal grace. The shrewdness that Jesus calls for is about building up the kingdom, Daniel said, by forgiving love that will never seem fair and will never seem just in a world that insists that if it's worth anything, you have to pay for it and you have to earn it. And Jesus says, it's already paid. I paid for it. You know, think about the society we live in. We can be a pretty self-centered bunch, can't we? We share in a culture and approach to life that believes wealth is good, and greed is good, and pleasure is good, and accumulating material wealth is good. And in all cases, it has one direction towards ourselves. It's best for me. It's how can I gain? It's how can I get ahead? And we see the consequences all around us. Larger fences to keep the poor and disenfranchised and marginalized in their place and closed over there. Greater home security, jealousy, fear, anger, hatred. Compromised friendships and relationships. Civil unrest. And if you go to the very far extreme, war. Because isn't that why one country goes to war against another country? So how they can gain for themselves. God created each and every person. God created you and I, each of us with a purpose. To be lived out faithfully in who we are, to be lived out in the priorities that we have, in the passions that we have, in our relationships with other people, in how we interact with all of God's created order that is around us. God has hopes for each and every one of us. But because of that, in quotation marks, I'm going to say gift of free will. Sometimes I wonder if it really is a gift. But it is a gift that God blessed us with when God created us. Because of that gift and because of the opportunity to exercise our free spirit, it's too easy to lose sight of that purpose for which God created us in the first place, and God's hope for us as His creation. I really like Eugene Peterson's The Message translation of this passage. And here's one verse in particular. Jesus says, I want you to be smart in the same way, but for what is right. It's important, but for what is right. Using every adversity to stimulate you to creative survival. Concentrate your attention on bare essentials. Really live, not complacently just getting by on good behavior. Jesus' call is for us to turn from greedy, self-centered culture of our time and to embrace that gospel mandate of living in a way that always, always, always cultivates and contributes to God's kingdom. And as we do that, we are called to be clever. We're called to be discerning. We are called to use good gospel judgment. We're called to contribute to wise decision-making. In other words, we're called to be shrewd. Shrewd in a way that is faithful to our mandate and our mission as followers and disciples of Jesus Christ. And I think there are many possible applications for that when we live out our day-to-day living. in the complexities of the world we live in our relationships with other people, whether that be those who live in our house, those who live in our neighborhood, those we meet at the grocery store, or pass on the sidewalk walking down the road. How do we face the trials and stresses of this life? And heaven knows we have trials and stresses, don't we? How do we interact with all of creation around us? We're observing the season of creation. Do we take ownership for how we have been part of compromising creation? And do we take responsibility saying, now I want to do something to make it right? In how we spend our money. I probably spend a lot of my money on things I want, not necessarily things I need. How do I look upon the suffering and injustice of others? I've sat with people who have looked at the poor and said, well, they put themselves in that position. I don't know that that's to be our response as faithful followers of Jesus Christ. I think we have countless opportunities to be shrewd for the kingdom of God and for the work of the gospel. Jesus reminds us that to be faithful with the little we've been given, that we've been blessed with, to use what God has given us, to search out God's desire for how we should use what God has given us, and to always put the kingdom first and not as an afterthought. Our motivation needs to be solely on accomplishing God's will, and remembering why do we do God's will? For God's glory and for God's praise, and not our own. It's not about our ego or building ourselves up. It's about remembering who is the one who has called us and gifted us in the first place. We're called not to be self-serving, but to be God-serving, with faithful, thankful hearts, choosing to do for God and not for ourselves and our own interests. And how do we know what God desires of us? We need to stay spiritually focused, spiritually attentive to God through prayer, through taking time to meditate, through looking at the world around us through the lens of the gospel, through reading the gospel, through coming together in community worship like this to be nurtured and fed with the word and the bread of life and the cup of salvation. We are to continually seek out God's will and hope for us. And that all we do in God's name in our discipleship as followers of Jesus Christ. We're to be resourceful in using the bounty of blessings that God continually gives us. And we are abundantly blessed. It may seem like just a small bit, but we are abundantly blessed. How do we use that? How do we think outside the box of what we've always done with our lives, with our faith, with our relationships? And we're called to look beyond what seems impossible in our finite human minds to the breadth of what is possible when we're empowered by the Holy Spirit. We're called to be resourceful, using what we do have, and not focusing and not complaining about what we don't have. As my friend Daniel reminded me and us, we are called to be instruments of God's grace. And as we do that, to contribute to God's economy and the ultimate value of the kingdom, using wealth of our spiritual insight God has and that God continues to bestow upon us. The world's economy asks, how can we do things more cheaply so that I can gain the most benefit? Irregardless of who or what may suffer in the process, both in the present and moment of now and into the future too. But as I read the gospel, that's not our mandate. That's not our mission. That's not our discipleship as followers of Jesus. I read an article yesterday that caught my attention. It was called Shrewd Saints. And I have to tell you, those are not two words that I would have put together at one time or other. But they go together. Shrewd saints. Think about what it means to be a saint. Saints, by their very nature, rise up to meet the challenges that are in front of them, whether it's in life or in faith or in the world. They know their limitations because they're human beings. They can't they act with faith. And especially with faith in God and what God can do in whatever that situation or challenge or opportunity that is right there in front of them. Acknowledging the problem, the issue, the situation, the opportunity, assessing strengths and weaknesses, forming a plan, acting boldly, having faith. We could do a lot worse in the face of a challenge, couldn't we? And remember something. Remember, we never have to face any challenge or any opportunity on our own, but always with the help of God and with the guidance and direction of the Holy Spirit. Over this month of September, we are observing that season of creation. And so I ask myself the question, how do we apply this parable to that issue? How do we apply the shrewd manager to the issue of the environment? That's an issue that looms large and seems so beyond anything that we can do to turn things around. But as shrewd saints and as shrewd stewards, even with something as daunting and overwhelming as what's happening and is happening to our creation, we can be the good stewards that God calls us to be when God first created us as human beings. And we can be the good stewards that we promised in our baptisms we will be when we are asked the question, will you safeguard the integrity of creation and respect, sustain, and renew the life of the earth? Well, I think it's going to take some shrewd thinking and some shrewd acting on our part to live out that promise. But don't forget, what's our response when we're asked that baptismal question? Will you safeguard the integrity of creation and respect, sustain, and renew the life of the earth? What's our response? I will with God's help. We never just stand there and say, yep, I'm going to do that. Because we know we can't on our own. I will with God's help. So this morning, as we reflect on that parable and try to understand it and try to figure out how we implement it in our lives, let's make the commitment to be like the shrewd manager. And as God calls us, let's use our shrewdness with a right motivation. And instead of saying we can't do everything in so many situations in our lives, let's faithfully do what we can do with what God has blessed us with. I guarantee you, our Master will be pleased with us too. Amen.